Insurance isn't one size fits all. That's why drivers have enjoyed Progressive's Name Your Price tool for years now. With the Name Your Price tool, you tell them what you want to pay, and they'll show you options that fit your budget. So whether you're picking out your first policy or just looking for something that works better for you and your family, they make it easy to see your options. Visit Progressive.com. Find a rate that works for you with the Name Your Price tool. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Hey there, Stackers. I'm Joe Saul-Sehy, and what's the cost of being conservative? It's funny because we think, well, I don't want to lose money, so I'm going to be really conservative. But what if you very safely never get anything done? And that truly is the cost, isn't it? In today's show, which is from our brother show, Earn and Invest, we're going to be chatting about exactly that. What is the cost of maybe, just maybe, being too conservative and never getting where you want to go? It's hosted by my good friend, Jordan Grumet, a.k.a. Doc G at Earn and Invest. And it's an interview with our also good friend, Jesse Cramer. And Jordan Grumet joins me now. Doc G, why was this interview so important to you to talk about maybe being too conservative?
Well, I think the problem is we're so worried about running out of money that we end up being incredibly conservative on not just one aspect of retirement savings, but multiple. And see, the problem is when you start stacking these conservative assumptions, they become exponential. So it's one thing if you're like, I need a safe withdrawal rate of 3.75 instead of 4. That's going to make a certain amount of difference. But if you add that onto discounting the fact that you're going to get Social Security and deciding that equities returns are going to be 4% instead of 6% or 8%, and when you stack those all together, eventually what you end up with is someone who's been so conservative, they have tons more money than they expected. And the goal is to actually spend the money, isn't it?
So I love that on one side, we're so conservative with our investments that we run out of money because we're afraid of running out of money. But on the other side, we're so conservative with our estimates that we end up with a ton of money left over and we never get the life that we thought we wanted.
And interestingly enough, I don't think the problem is being too conservative with our investments. So certainly there are some people who are like, stay away from equities completely, et cetera. But as we go further, we realize that actually you can still be relatively conservative with equities, right? So modern portfolio theory suggested 60-40. A lot of people talk about a 70-30 split now between equities and bonds.
OG 100-0.
100-0. But the truth of the matter is, you could have even 40% equities and 60% bonds and still probably come out okay. I mean, obviously there's a limit. But you're really moderating returns as you do that at the cost or at the benefit of having much less risk. And so I don't think it's really the investment issue that we have here. It's much less likely we're going to run out of money in this case, at least in this community where I think everyone is ultra careful.
I was going to say in the wider community, it's the opposite.
Yes,
it is we're so very conservative, we never get anywhere. In this community, it's that we are uber careful about the assumptions. We're comfortable with the risk, but we're not comfortable with the assumptions. And so we underlive. Well, guys, that's exactly why I wanted to share this with you today. I have one other thing before we press play on this wonderful episode of Earn and Invest, which is that our Read This Before You Complete Your Workplace Benefits Guide is now live. StackingBenjamins.com/benefits. The great thing is you may change jobs every 4.2 years like most people do. The government might change the game. Heck, I'm so old, Doc G, that when I started, there was no HSA. There was no Roth 401k. There wasn't even an FSA, all that crazy stuff. The government's going to change the game. You're going to change jobs. You have lifetime access. And even if those two things don't happen, you know what's going to happen? Your HR benefits manager is going to go, ooh, you know what? We can either get cheaper, we can get better, we can get something, and they'll change the game. And every time something changes, you just go back into the guide. We continually update it. We made it to be the best value proposition we could think of, so our stackers are always in a safe place. StackingBenjamins.com/benefits gets you there. All right. Are you too conservative about your retirement? You just heard him a second ago. You're going to hear him now with guest Jesse Cramer on Earn and Invest. Steve, press play, please. In business, there is no room for guesswork. Every shipment matters. Every deadline counts. And when you're trying to keep operations running smoothly, the last thing you need is uncertainty. That's why reliability is at the core of USPS Ground Advantage. From the moment your package is first scanned in, it moves through a secure nationwide network, aiding in a timely and accurate delivery. You get near real-time tracking so you can keep up with your shipments. And with affordable upfront pricing, there are no hidden fees or surprise surcharges to throw off your cost sheets. It all adds up to predictable deliveries you can depend on, because knowing your logistics are handled lets you focus on everything else, your customers, your team, and the future you're building. Visit USPS.com/Ground Advantage to start shipping with confidence. USPS Ground Advantage. We mean business. Dell PCs with Intel Inside are built for the moments you plan and the ones you don't. They're for those all-night study sessions, the moment you're working from a cafe and realize every outlet's taken, the times you're deep in your flow and can't be interrupted by an auto update. That's why Dell builds tech that adapts to you. Built with long-lasting batteries so you're not scrambling for an outlet, and built-in intelligence that makes updates around your schedule, not in the middle of it. Find technology built for the way you work at Dell.com/Dell PCs. Built for you.
I'm Jesse Cramer, and this is the Earn and Invest podcast.
I am very conservative when it comes to time, and it sometimes drives me crazy. Let's say that I have an appointment in the city. I usually add in a few minutes extra for possible traffic, then a few extra minutes in case parking is difficult, and then, of course, a few minutes if I have trouble finding the building. Needless to say, all those extra minutes add up, which means, of course, I show up to my appointment 30 minutes early and sit and wait, which is no big deal because the stakes are low. Being overly conservative in this case is annoying but not a fatal flaw. The act of being overly conservative, however, can be particularly vexing when it comes to managing your finances, even more so when it comes to retirement planning. Today, we discuss why. Jesse Cramer started the Best Interest platform in 2018. He was working as a mechanical engineer designing satellite telescopes. But deep down, he was a personal finance and investing nerd. He created the Best Interest blog and podcast to share what he's learned and to add genuine signal to an otherwise noisy internet. Jesse Cramer, welcome to Earn and Invest. Was being a rocket scientist not enough for you?
Doc G, thank you for having me here. It's a real honor. Yeah, it's interesting. Now, technically, I think a rocket scientist will tell you that they actually designed the propulsion systems that get out into space, whereas what I was doing was more on the payload side, right? The thing that is being launched or the end product that's going to end up on orbit rather. But yeah, being an aerospace engineer, working with really smart people was extremely rewarding. Let me start with that, right? I had some colleagues who were just absolutely brilliant, but my day job was sitting behind a computer for 8 hours, 10 hours a day doing analysis work in for what it's worth in a building with no windows, because we were working on some things that you don't necessarily want people peeking through your windows on. And I enjoy talking to people. I enjoy working to people. I enjoy doing things like what we're doing right now. And a change of careers really helped me fulfill that part of my brain and my heart and in that direction. So became a personal finance nerd, an investing nerd, started sharing it on the internet, grassroots, it's grown, and here we are today.
Where did the interest start? How old were you and how did you come upon it?
My mid-20s, I'd say. And it probably really started at my very first job where, my dad told me, yep, you want to participate in this thing called a 401k. I didn't know why, but I said, okay. Fast forward a couple years and all of a sudden I have a 5-figure balance in there. And where'd that come from? And, considering I have over $10,000 here in this 401k, I probably should know more about how it's invested and why it's invested that way. So that was part of it. And then another very similar part was I feel like a lot of people in their mid 20s or early in their careers start to get this feeling that I felt, which is I was earning a reasonable income, certainly enough to pay off my bills, but I had a car loan, I had credit card debt. I knew I should be participating in that 401k, maybe in this thing that I've heard of called a Roth IRA. So my point is I had a lot of different potential uses for my money, but I had no idea how to prioritize them, why to prioritize them. I had all those questions and not enough answers. I did a bunch of self-study and DIY. I read the books that I've listened to the podcast, I read the blogs, all these kind of things that we've all probably heard of, whether it's the Mr. Money Mustaches or the Simple Path to Wealth, the J.L. Collins. And sooner or later, I started sharing with my friends, sharing with my colleagues. They encouraged me to write, they encouraged me to teach, and that led to the actual content creation that I'm doing now.
Just a moment of insider baseball before we talk about conservative retirement planning. So you get to this crux, you realize, okay, maybe my job is not as fulfilling. I am a personal finance nerd. There's really one of two directions you can go at that point. Maybe you can do both directions at the same time. One is to build a platform and go ahead and start putting content out there and try to make money on it. The other is to become a certified financial planner or get some type of credential and financially advise people. What did you decide to do and why did you make that decision?
Yeah. So the answer is I suppose I decided to do both, which is at first it was just the platform. And for, let me think about this now, 3.5 years, I ran the best interest while still working as a mechanical aerospace engineer. Eventually, though, I realized, like I kind of alluded to before, my favorite part of my work week would be when a reader or a listener of the best interest would reach out to me, describe their scenario, and say, what would you do in my shoes, Jesse? Essentially, they were asking for financial advice. And so I did my due diligence. I kind of looked around the world, the investing world or the financial advice world, and tried to find a place where I could land on my feet. I could potentially change careers and land on my feet and feel really good about what I was doing. And sure enough, I ended up for the last 2.5 years now. I've been working at a fiduciary fee-only wealth management firm here in Rochester. I'm in upstate New York. And we have, I think, 6 CFPs on staff, 3 accountants, some chartered financial analysts, a very smart team. And I'm an engineer, so I want to feel like we're working with the facts, that we have experts on staff, and that's what we do. And I think slowly but surely, I'm going to work towards my CFP as well. I really want to. As we were talking about before, Jordan, I've got a 1-month-old, and just I've spinning a lot of plates, but the CFP is something that I would love to get. Because ultimately, right, I'm a spreadsheet nerd, right? And that's what CFPs do.
Yeah, and since you're going to be up at night anyway with a 1-month-old, you might as well be studying for your CFP. We are going to get to the topic for our podcast today, the topic of our conversation. This is taken from a blog post from the Best Interest blog called The Crushing Cost of Conservative Retirement Planning. I love this article because a lot of times we talk about retirement failure. Here we're talking about something very different. So first and foremost, why do you think people are so conservative when it comes to retirement planning?
For a totally understandable reason, Jordan. I mean, right, the fear that we feel, the stress that we feel about the potential outcome of running out of money before we die, that's real. And it's a scenario that none of us want to have to go through. And if you ask anybody, hey, would you rather die with $1 million that went unspent, or would you rather have $1 million shortfall before you die? I mean, the answer is, I think 100 out of 100 people are going to say, oh, I'd rather just have the $1 million that went unspent. And I'm in that boat too. And I see you nodding your head. You're probably in that boat too to some extent.
Totally. Yeah.
But what if we kind of take that to a bit of an extreme and say, okay, well, what if you die with $3 million and meanwhile you were really tightening the belt your whole retirement, you were stressed about money the whole time, you didn't take that trip, you didn't eat that meal, and you still died with $3 million because you were just way too conservative the whole time? Is that the outcome you want? Probably not. And so the idea here is maybe we can try to find some sort of in between, or maybe we can just readjust what people consider conservative retirement planning. Because I think that's part of the article too is, well, just how conservative should conservative be?
I think a big piece of this is this consideration of retirement failure. And I think if we're going to talk about retirement failure, we actually have to parse this out. The group of people who are not paying attention to their finances, who are not listening to podcasts like ours, who are not reading blogs about personal finance, is its own distinct group of people. And that's not necessarily who we're talking about today. We're talking about people who are listening to you and I talk about this stuff, who are reading blogs, etc. Of that second group, the people who are paying attention and want to get things right, how common is retirement failure? Is this something you are seeing in your life? Because we talk about it all the time, but I don't actually see it much. Are you?
No, not much. You're totally right. There's this selection bias, and I'm sure you can find similar selection biases in other realms of life, but the personal finance and investing selection bias is totally there, which is, just as you described, the people who are paying the most attention, and therefore because they are paying the most attention, are probably the least likely to fail. They are at least aware of the concept of failure because they're paying attention, and therefore they're actively fighting against failure. So it's this kind of catch-22 where the more you pay attention, the more you're aware of risks. That's another way of putting it. The more you're aware of risks, the more you're going to put the processes in place to mitigate those risks, which is terrific. But then also you might just be spending too much of your energy mitigating risk. It's like, well, the fire chief, of course, the fire chief is going to have fire alarms in every single room and is going to be following all these rules, like by design. That's good. It's good to some extent. But then if you get to be this kind of OCD fire chief who just your entire wall is covered in fire alarms, okay, that's a bit too conservative. And so that's a really interesting paradox that you find here, Doc G. I mean, any of your listeners ever come back to you and said, I pay attention to everything and I'm going to fail in my retirement despite how I've been paying attention?
I've never really seen that. We talk about it and we worry about it. But my advice actually now is simple when it comes to failing at retirement. If you don't want to fail at retirement, think about it, pay attention to it, and actually have an asset allocation. Because in my opinion, like we were talking about, the act of learning about it and paying attention will mean that you're automatically going to adjust. And in fact, you're probably going to end up being at more risk of what we're talking about today, which is being overly conservative. But yeah, the simple answer is if you don't want to fail at retirement, pay attention to retirement.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
Sounds overly conservative, but it's true. Or
Yeah,
overly simple, I should say, but it's true.
It is true. And it's just like so many things in life, so many things in life. If you sweep it under the rug, you might be setting yourself up for trouble. But as soon as you lift that carpet up and see what's there, that's half the battle. Just exposing whatever the issue is to sunlight. Health and finances have these amazing parallels. You as a doctor probably understand this better than almost anyone here. But I can honestly say that my finances are in very good shape. My health is not nearly as in good shape. But part of the reason why is just for so long, I just said, whatever, I'm relatively active. Maybe I'm carrying a few too many pounds, but I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to think about it. Well, that catches up to you eventually. And you either have to start thinking about it or you're going to start slipping down that slippery slope even faster.
So I was pointed in my introduction to talk about this concept of being on time. And the mistake I make when being on time is this idea of stacking conservative assumptions, right? So traffic is going to be bad, so I need extra minutes for that. Then parking is going to be bad, so I need extra minutes for that. And I don't know my way around downtown, so even after I park, I might have trouble finding the building. Let's talk about how that works when it comes to retirement planning. We'll get into the specifics of each of these later, but talk about some of those conservative assumptions that we tend to stack when it comes to retirement planning.
Yeah, I mean, some of the common ones that I hear, because there is a lot of different things go into retirement planning. And let's just think about it. Well, we have our investments, sure. We have the different kind of accounts that they're coming out of. Social Security, if you're listening to this as an American, Social Security, you might have a pension. Not many of us do, but you might have a pension. What you're spending, like what will your retirement expenses be? What's inflation going to be during your retirement? How about, we talked about the investments, but what kind of return expectations do you have? When we talk investments, that's really the big one, is what are your expected returns? What taxes are you going to pay? That's a really big one, especially right now. There's this Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that is going to sunset at the end of 2025. And not to mention there's growing national debt. So all these things, you throw all those things into a pot, Jordan, and there might be some others that I'm forgetting, but you start to realize one could take a conservative or even a hyper-conservative tack on all of those different variables that we just described. And I think what we're going to talk about today is that if you do that, you're going to end up in a very, very conservative place.
Yeah, and the problem is with the conservative place, you end up collecting all this money that you never use, which, as we talked about in that first example, okay, a little extra money, great, but when it gets to the point where you're not living life, it becomes an issue. So let's parse out each of these assumptions and talk about at least a few of them. Let's start with Social Security. Almost everyone I know in the financial independence retire early community assumes that Social Security isn't even a thing. Like people in their 30s and 40s. And I get part of that, especially if you want to retire when you're 25, then you probably do not have enough Social Security credits that you're going to be getting Social Security. But a lot of us are in our 40s and 50s and we're into the FIRE movement and we're talking about retirement. We've stacked plenty of these Social Security credits. In your brain, is there any possibility that we won't receive at least some type of Social Security as we get older?
Yeah, I like the way that you framed that question, because I think there are different reasons to be conservative when it comes to Social Security. One reason, as you outlined, could be the fact that if you are a FIRE disciple and your work history is so short, yeah, maybe you just won't have built up enough credits for there to be meaningful Social Security. That's fine. Or you could say, I'm going to retire at 40 and my full retirement age is 67. By the time I get there, it might even be older than 67. So yeah, for the next 27 to 30 years, I won't be collecting Social Security. Why should I even bank on it? That's a little more, it's a little on the conservative side, but I could understand, at least, especially for those first 30 years of that person's retirement, yeah, no Social Security. But the bigger one that I see, whether it's from the financial independence movement or just from the DIYer movement, is this idea of someone who says, we're a 58-year-old couple, we want to retire soon, and we're not going to assume Social Security is going to be there because I saw this thing in the news that said by 2034, the Social Security is going to run out of money. And you tell me, Jordan, I mean, have you debunked or talked about that half truth before? I mean, is it worth going into that right now?
Yeah, we haven't. So most people don't realize the difference between what's extra in the system versus what's paid in every year.
Right, exactly. So my understanding is that, yes, by 2034, 2035, based on current burn rates, this Social Security trust will run out of money. But what many people don't realize is that on an annual basis, whether we're talking about right now here in 2024, that about 90% of the outflows from Social Security are directly funded by inflows from taxes, meaning if the trust were to run out of money right now, there'd only be roughly a 10% shortfall. The actuaries, the Social Security actuaries, say that by 2034, that might be about a 20% shortfall, 25% shortfall, meaning 75 to 80% of your Social Security that you are due, Jordan, 75 to 80% is going to be funded by future taxes in the year 2034. So therefore, it's very conservative to assume that Social Security will not exist in 2034. If you want to be conservative and think that maybe legislation won't change and they won't do anything to fix Social Security, if that's your point of view that you want to put in your retirement plan, I still think you should assume about 80% of what is due to you will be there. I think that's as conservative as I would recommend anybody goes on Social Security.
This amazes me. People don't realize in the financial independence community, a lot of people talk about living off of $40,000 or $50,000 a year. You have two adults who've worked most of, their 20s, 30s, 40s, and maybe some of their 50s. You're going to be collecting jointly more than that every year, which is the ultimate surprise when you realize that maybe Social Security will fund all of my retirement and the rest is extra. I've seen that happen to a few big names in the FIRE community who've lived on very little, and they got Social Security and realized that they could live completely off of it.
Yeah, it is surprising. It's not uncommon. I think it's like, actually, I think I do know this stat. I think the average American collects something like $1,800 to $2,000 a month as an individual. And when we say average American here, we have to think about what the average job is or what the average salary was. I mean, we're talking about people who inflation adjusted today in 2024, their average career earnings might have been in the $45,000, $50,000, $60,000 range. And their monthly paycheck from Social Security is $1,800 to $2,000 a month, $24,000 a year. As a couple, we're talking $45,000 or $50,000
that's no
a year.
joke.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially for frugal FI people. So yeah, Social Security is certainly something not to overlook. If you're too conservative and you think it's going to be zero for you, I would push back.
So let's look at another one of the assumptions. this is investment returns. Not that long ago, I was listening to Ben Felix Rational Reminder podcast. The guy's really, really smart. And he was talking about this idea that the equity premium, this idea that, the general stock market is going to return 8 to 10% on a regular basis for the rest of our lives, maybe overblown a little bit, that we might be too aggressive when we're really looking for those kind of returns. This is a problem I think all of us are going to have. Many of us say, I'm betting on the market, right? I'm not going to stock pick. I'm not going to try to manipulate returns above and beyond what the market will bear. But what is a reasonable return estimate for someone who's going to look at market returns for the next 20 or 30 years? And is that something we can even figure out?
Yeah, what a deep question. Starting on the second part of your question, is that something we can even figure out? That to me is the hard part of the question, because I think the easy thing to do, and it's something that I do, I'll fully admit to this, is you look at the past 80 or 100 or 130 years, whatever your preferred time period is, you say, oh, from World War II until today, here's what historical returns have been. Here's the compound average. Sure, maybe I can make it a little bit more conservative than the past because you don't know if the future is going to be like the past. But either way, you do something where you say, you know what, historically, a 60-40 portfolio has returned 9% per year over long periods of time. That's before adjusting for inflation, right? Those are nominal dollars, but boom, 9%, 60-40 portfolio. That's a true fact. The hard question is, because we don't want to be overly optimistic, we also don't want to be overly pessimistic. The hard question is, do we feel comfortable that the future is going to resemble that past? Do we want to worry about things like demographic changes? Demographic changes are already affecting Europe in some pretty big ways. The USA is one of the least demographically affected countries when we look out decades into the future, when it comes to like population decline that some countries are going to see, and population decline leads to economic decline and leads to maybe stock. Okay, it's easy to get ourselves wound up, and there might be some facts there. And that's why it's really hard to say, will the future stock market resemble the past? I don't have the answer. I don't have the crystal ball. But my hesitation, again, is to be a doomsayer and say, no, it's going to be negative returns for the next 30 years. And here's the reason why. I don't have any evidence to say that. Long story short, I don't think there's anything wrong with a little bit of conservatism, that the future might be not quite as great as the past in terms of returns. But I just think we have to be very careful about how much conservatism we bake in there.
And I think the same argument can be made for inflation, right? So we're talking about investment returns. Now, the other coin of that is to be overly conservative and assume inflation of 3.5 or 4 or 5 or 6% over the long term, when traditionally and historically it hasn't been that. But I feel like the argument is the same with investment returns. Interestingly enough, most people who study retirement realize that one way we go wrong or overly conservative when it comes, for instance, to something like a safe withdrawal rate is we set our safe withdrawal rate at 4% or 3.5%, but a lot of times we don't inflation adjust. Even if we mean to, our lifestyle doesn't inflation adjust to the extent that inflation occurs out in the real world. So we have a personal inflation level, and people who are careful enough to be looking at these kind of things automatically fight inflation. So I don't know if I have a question here other than to say it sounds like we have the similar phenomenon when it comes to investment returns as we have with inflation.
Yeah, we do. And it's important to realize when we're approaching this conversation today about conservatism that investment returns and inflation are related. And what I mean is, if someone decides to be, like I said, a 60-40 portfolio historically returns about 9% per year. Okay, for the sake of argument, Jordan, we're going to be conservative. We're going to say it's only 7% per year, not 9, but 7% for our math. And then on inflation, historically, inflation's been about 3% per year. Let's be conservative again. Let's say it's 5, not 3. So, okay, so I reduced my returns by 2%. I increased inflation by 2%.
It's huge.
My
Huge.
real return just went from 9 minus 3, which is 6% per year, to 7 minus 5, which is 2% per year. That is a huge difference.
Yeah, and over 30 years. Yeah, I mean, you're talking millions and millions of dollars on a regular portfolio. Yeah,
exactly right. And that's why, I mean, we might get into this later, but if you apply some of these assumptions to a perfectly normal retirement scenario, it could result in decades of time, meaning the safe age for someone to retire could shift from 55 to 75, simply by stacking these conservative assumptions in what I would consider an incorrect way.
We are talking to Jesse Cramer. He started the Best Interest platform in 2018. He was working as a mechanical engineer designing satellite telescopes, but deep down, he was a personal finance investing nerd. And we are talking about being overly conservative when it comes to retirement planning, stacking conservative assumptions, and what that can do to your overall retirement plan. We're going to take a short break. I'm Doc G, and this is the Earn and Invest podcast.
Insurance isn't one size fits all. That's why drivers have enjoyed Progressive's Name Your Price tool for years now. With the Name Your Price tool, you tell them what you want to pay, and they'll show you options that fit your budget. So whether you're picking out your first policy or just looking for something that works better for you and your family, they make it easy to see your options. Visit Progressive.com. Find a rate that works for you with the Name Your Price tool. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
What would you do if your online store converted 36% more shoppers? You could take 36% more vacation.
Another pina colada? Yes, please.
Open a new retail location with 36% more square feet.
Fantastic.
Hire 36% more help.
You're hired and you're hired.
Shopify has the world's best converting checkout, up to 36% better than other e-commerce platforms. What you do with those extra sales is up to you. Switch to Shopify today at shopify.com/listen and get a $1 trial. Shopify.com/listen.
Did you know Fast Growing Trees is America's largest and most trusted online nursery with thousands of trees and plants and over 2 million happy customers? Whether you're planting fruit trees, adding privacy, brightening things up with flowers, or bringing in houseplants, Fast Growing Trees has it all. Even better, they can help you find options that are right for your climate, your space, and lifestyle. Click Order Grow. Every plant arrives healthy with the Alive and Thrive guarantee straight to your door. So if you're ready to get planting, this is the moment. Right now, they have great deals on spring planting essentials, up to half off on select plants. And listeners to our show get 20% off their first purchase when using the code WWO at checkout. That's an additional 20% off. Better plants and better growing at fastgrowingtrees.com using the code WWO at checkout. Fastgrowingtrees.com, code WWO. Now's the perfect time to plant. Let's grow together. Use WWO to save today. Offer is valid for a limited time. Terms and conditions apply. Go to growingfasttrees.com for details.
We are back with Jesse Cramer. He is the creator of the Best Interest blog and podcast, which he uses to share what he's learned and add genuine signal to an otherwise noisy internet. And we are talking about stacking conservative assumptions when it comes to retirement. We had mentioned this idea of thinking that Social Security won't be there. It'll be severely reduced. We talked about return estimates. We've also talked about overly estimating what inflation will be. We could also go as far as talking about things like federal tax rates, et cetera. We're not going to, but let's ask a better question. How do we do this better then without putting ourselves at risk? How do we decide, okay, I'm stacking too many assumptions. Which ones do we hold on to and which ones do we let go of?
So I think the way to approach that question, there's a couple ways. Let me start with that. There's a couple different ways. Now, the first way, which I'll very simply describe, is to be flexible and to revisit this topic relatively frequently. I think most FI people, most FI experts, I should say, most CFPs, most retirement experts will say, this isn't something that you make the plan when you're 40 and then you never look at it again, or you follow that plan that you made when you were 40 every single step forever. No. I mean, you want to revisit this relatively frequently because you might and probably will have to adjust. So we'll start with that, the being flexible, adjusting, revisiting idea. But maybe more on point with what you're asking, Doc G, is the idea that I think we should use very little conservatism in the inputs to our analysis. And what I mean is, earlier we talked about Social Security. I think people should assume the full Social Security amount that their Social Security statement tells them they'll get. Maybe if they want to, they can go down to that 80% mark, but they should not go any more conservative than that. For the 60-40 portfolio, let's say investment portfolio, I think they should assume an 8 to 9% per year return over sufficiently long periods of time. What I'm saying there is don't bake any conservatism into those inputs into your analysis. And then only when you get to the end of your analysis, if you want to be conservative, then go ahead, apply just a 20% smeared conservatism onto the end of your analysis. And what I mean by that is if the end of your analysis says that you're going to retire safely at 57 with $2 million and you're currently 47, so that's a 10-year projection to retirement. Okay, you want to be conservative? Fine. Give yourself 12 years or 14 years. You can do that at the end because it's very easy to measure that conservatism that you apply at the end. It's very easy to understand. What's a lot more challenging for people to understand is how the input conservatism that they could have used, right? I'm telling you not to use input conservatism, but it's hard for people to tie any sort of input conservatism into their end result. And so that's the part where everything gets a little confusing, right? You put all these inputs into a black box, you get this output number. We want to try to avoid that if we can.
I like that because it gets rid of the stacking, right? So if I'm worried
Correct.
about my trip downtown for a meeting, maybe I should say, look, in a perfect situation, this takes 30 minutes. So I'm going to give myself 35. But then at least I'm not stacking each decision, which makes it exponential in a sense.
Correct. And we need to ask ourselves, let's use your example, Jordan. I mean, what are the odds that there is bad traffic and no parking and you twist your ankle on the curb and this and that? Like,
this is Chicago. So yeah,
but
this is Chicago. So we'll have a few of those, but yes, I see your point.
and it's the same thing in retirement. What are the odds that Social Security runs out and your investment returns are terrible and inflation is high and you spend twice as much per year as you did? We have to be as rational and reasonable as we can be. And I think that's an approach that some people will appreciate.
You talked about this idea also of adjustment, right? So even if you get your initial assertions wrong, if you're willing to pay attention and adjust, you can still make up for it. What I see in our community, and especially if they stack these assumptions to begin with, is the adjustment is that we need to start spending more. How do we get people to actually do that? Because I found that after being so conservative, to flip the switch and say, oh, I've got an extra $10,000, let's take another vacation, is something that seems easy kind of as we talk about it, but it's not really easy to practice.
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways. One way that can work for some people is almost to blank slate your 4% rule. And what I mean by that is you'll have someone who retires at 50. And the 4% rule dictates to them that they could spend 80 grand a year for the rest of their life. 10 years go on, their portfolio has actually doubled in size because they've essentially been, they've had great market returns and maybe they've been underspending, but they're still going off of that assumption of 80 grand inflation adjusted that they made when they were 50. Whereas if they just paused at that point and redid the math with the 4% rule again today, they'd realize, they could probably spend whatever it is, 160 grand inflation adjusted for the rest of their life. So that's one way. It's simply just to say, like, what if you retired today and just reran your 4% rule or 3.5% or whatever it is?
And some would argue you could even go up depending on where you are. But as you get 50 and 60 and 70, it shouldn't be a 4% rule. Maybe it should be a 5 or 6 or 7 because you're no longer looking at me morbidly. You're no longer looking at a 30-year portfolio.
That's exactly right. And that's the second place I was going to take this is the nerdy part in me, but I enjoy looking at those Social Security Administration actuarial life expectancy tables, or at least it's good to have an idea that, the average 60-year-old male has 22 years of life left, or whatever that is. And that's another place that you can approach this from, and you can be conservative. You can look at your own health and your own family health and how healthy you are as an individual. So maybe you want to adjust those assumptions a little bit. But you're right. The 4% rule was, in and of itself, is quite a conservative rule that was made for, I think it's a 50-50 portfolio, stocks and bonds, projected for a 30-year retirement. So if you're sitting here at age 40, okay, you're going to have probably longer than a 30-year retirement. That's fine. But if you're listening to this at age 60, well, do you have 30 years left? Maybe you do. And it's just a question of how conservative you really want to be. But I think that's another way, Dr. G, is just to revisit your initial retirement rule assumptions, spending assumptions. And yeah, if your portfolio is just going up and up and up because you're underspending, well, maybe you either need to spend more and enjoy it, or you need to start asking yourself, what am I going to do with this big pot of money at the end of the day? Going to family, going to charity, those kind of things.
Yeah, I want to mention as we're talking about safe withdrawal rates and the 4% rule, it is overly conservative to start with. First and foremost, it was actually like the 4.1% rule. So already we've said 4% because it's easier. But the other thing was it was a basement safe withdrawal rate. So it was supposed to withstand the worst of situations. So it was already baked in that this was going to be super, super conservative. So if you are following the 4% rule to the T, the likelihood is you're going to be fine for 30 years and possibly end up with more than you started with.
Yeah, there's a great stat on that, Doc G, that maybe you've heard before. I first saw it on Michael Kitces, his website. He's like the nerdiest of financial planners out there. Really great content if you want to nerd out on financial planning. But he backtested the 4% rule for a huge number of historical scenarios. And a retiree following the 4% rule is just as likely to die with a single dollar less in their portfolio. So let's say they start with $1 million. They're just as likely to die with less than $1 million as they are to die with 5 million or more. They're just as likely to quintuple their portfolio as they are to spend a single dollar less. And that shows the amount of conservatism that's there baked into the 4% rule. It's an amazing stat.
So what is the fallout of this? I mean, so if we're overly conservative, why is this bad in the end?
Well, yeah, I think if you're overly conservative, quite simply, you are going to spend years, if not decades, potentially working in a job that you find very fulfilling, but just as likely working in a place that you don't find fulfilling, when instead you could be pursuing the dreams that the FI movement is made of, which is, pursuing all the other fun stuff in life. And when it comes to real takeaways today, when I look back at this article that you're referencing that I wrote in June, Doc G, I ran the same scenario for this hypothetical 50-year-old with a very conservative set of assumptions, a relatively aggressive set of assumptions, and then something in the middle. And I think it was maybe an 18-year difference in their expected retirement date, or a 21-year difference between the overly conservative at first analysis and the maybe too aggressive analysis. But even when I used what I consider to be very reasonable assumptions, it was something like a 15-year difference in their retirement date. So that's what you're talking about.
What you're talking about is years to retirement. So you had a hypothetical person. You said how many years to retire based on conservative adjustments, aggressive adjustments, or somewhere in between. And 18 years is a big difference. That's a lot of life you could be spent working that you could be doing other things.
It's huge. It's huge. And so if there's anything for listeners to consider today, it would be, if you're doing this math on your own, whether you're using one of those excellent free online FI calculators, whether you're running your own spreadsheet, I would highly suggest that you tweak those inputs. And if you're naturally a conservative person, just for kicks and giggles, get rid of your conservatism for an analysis and just look and see what the range of outcomes is. And this is the engineer in me speaking. Let's drive something all the way to one extreme and then drive it all the way to the other extreme, just so I can understand the range of possibilities here. I would highly recommend that someone does that so they can understand how many years of employment or years of early retirement they are potentially costing themselves through their conservative assumptions.
So let's look at the other side of the argument, being overly aggressive with your assumptions. Most of us are familiar with Bill Perkins' book, Die with Zero. What do you think about that ethos? Because it seems to be the exact opposite of what we're describing here. It's like, no. Spend as much as you can, get the most out of your dollars. How do you think that relates to what we're talking about today?
I mean, I definitely think there's a place for balance. I've seen firsthand the emotion or the fear, the loss aversion that people have toward running out of money too soon. And I just think that is an outcome that, listen, we are all these loss averse mammals where the pain of loss hurts so much more than the gain of accomplishing something. And therefore, I think we really have to respect that. And I think we have to respect that in a lot of different pursuits in financial planning, that realization that losses really hurt. And for that reason, I'm not sure I'm quite as far out on the spectrum as Bill Perkins is in terms of spending every last dime and having that last check bounce. But it is a spectrum. And there's a reason I use that term. And I think my personal position is certainly more on the Bill Perkins end of the spectrum than probably the average FI opinion that I read. I think the average FI opinion, the average DIYer opinion is more conservative than I would recommend.
Any suggestions on dealing with that loss aversion anxiety? Because I believe that is at the heart of a lot of the problems many of us in the financial independence community have. And certainly people just retirement planning either way, whether they're, retiring early or retiring at a traditional age. Loss aversion really causes us a lot of anxiety. How do we do with that?
It's a $1 trillion question, probably to some extent, Jordan, but definitely $1 billion question. I think some of it, this is my personal opinion, education has helped me out so much, right? Getting educated on this stuff. We've already kind of touched on it today, shining light on these topics that maybe are a little uncomfortable and we want to sweep under the carpet. Well, educating, understanding the numbers, having faith in the numbers goes such a long way towards realizing that, okay, I'm afraid of losing money in the stock market, but actually the more I read about it and the more I understood that long-term investment and I look at the past numbers, the more I realized that for this part of my portfolio, the stock market is appropriate. That's the goal. That's the place where we want people to get to.
Well, Jesse, I wanted to thank you for coming on the show today. Look, what I was talking about in my introduction, being overly conservative with time, the truth of the matter is there are not a lot of stakes there. But when we're talking about being overly conservative when it comes to retirement planning, the stakes are real. It could be the difference between retiring today and retiring in 18 years. It could be the difference between having a retirement that really fulfills your dreams, doing the things you want to do, versus a retirement that's full of stress and anxiety and worries about loss aversion. Jesse, what you suggested, I think, is fantastic. Instead of stacking these conservative assumptions, I love this idea of let's use the basic numbers that we have, the numbers that have historically been correct, and then let's make a conservative assumption at the end. And maybe we take a 10% conservative assumption at the end to make sure that we have what we need. I want to end this show the way we end every show by asking you what is up next in your life and where people can find you. So first and foremost, what is happening at Best Interest, the Best Interest blog and podcast? What's going on?
It's still as fun a project as ever. I love writing. I love podcasting. The blog is kind of slow and steady. I enjoy writing these articles. The podcast, though, is really taking off, and I'm really proud of how the podcast has sounded for, the last year and a half or so, including an appearance by Doc G himself, listeners. And so they're both really fun and just a great way of interacting with the public and sharing information as I learn it. I mean, one of my favorite things to do is actually take some of the lessons that I'm learning from working with a team of CFPs, from working with real families on their finances and real problems, and just writing about their problems, making it anonymous, of course, but then sharing these lessons learned with the world. I think it's really fun. It's a fun way for me to learn, and it's been a fun way for my readers to learn. So you can find it the address is bestinterest.blog. And probably the easiest way to follow, I send a weekly email that not only shares my new articles, but will share cool podcasts, cool articles that I've read from around the internet. So it's a nice little content curation newsletter, and I would encourage anyone to subscribe.
Jesse Cramer, thank you so much for coming on Earn and Invest today.
Doc G, can't thank you enough. This was awesome.
That's a wrap. I really love this conversation with Jesse Cramer. We're talking about stacking conservative assumptions when it comes to retirement. It's the reason that many people find they have millions and millions of dollars more in retirement than they thought they would. This conversation has made me think about other ways in which we conservatively stack assumptions. And I realize we not only do this when it comes to retirement savings, but we do it when it comes to leaving work or retiring. A lot of times we stack these conservative assumptions, and that convinces us that it's too early to retire or we shouldn't leave a job that we don't love. So there's lots of people listening right now who probably have reached their financial independence number. They feel that they have enough financially, and yet they give themselves all sorts of reasons not to leave a job they don't like. And a big reason they do this is they stack conservative assumptions, very similar to our retirement planning money. We do the same with our decision to leave work. So let's think about what some of these assumptions are. Assumption number one, when it comes to not leaving work when you have enough money, is sequence of returns risk. Okay, you guys know what this is. This is the idea that if the year you retire, they're really, really bad equity returns, and that lasts a few years, it cuts down your portfolio so low that even if returns increase after that, you start at such a low starting place that it's going to kill your ability to survive 30 years or more on that portfolio. Sequence of returns risk is a real thing, but you have to remember most of the studies about the 4% rule looked at the worst 30-year periods in our history, even right around the Depression. That number of 4%, it's actually 4.1 in the studies, was supposed to be able to manage even bad sequence of returns. So it's a pretty conservative estimate if you're staying at work because you're worried about sequence of returns. That's what I call the first conservative assumption when it comes to leaving your job. Let's look at another one, runaway inflation. We have just come out of a big inflationary period. And so people are worried that the inflation adjustment to our income is going to be so large that it's going to erode our portfolio. Traditionally, we know that inflation generally runs between 2.5 and 3%, but a lot of people assume a much higher inflation rate, and therefore they think they can't retire, even if they don't enjoy their job. Next, I would say my third conservative assumption when it comes to retiring early that people suffer from is black swan events. People think that something major is going to happen and they're going to go bankrupt, whether it's going to be a medical problem or some problem with their property or some problem with the United States and the government and our banking system. Black swan events happen, but a lot of times they happen and we don't suspect them. That's why they're black swan events. There's not much you can do about those. So if you are using that as a reason not to retire, it's never going to be good time to retire because a black swan event can wipe you out at any time. There's not much we can do about that. You have to get used to uncertainty. So the answer is not to prolong your work life. The answer is not to save more money. The answer is to get used to uncertainty because no matter what we do, there will always be uncertainty. Next, major conservative assumption, why people don't leave work when they have enough money to and they don't like their jobs. They think they'll be bored or they'll miss work, which is really interesting because a lot of people don't like their jobs. But that goes with the next assumption, which is, okay, let's say you quit for a year or two and you're bored and you miss work. Can't you always go back or go back to a similar job or find a new job you enjoy? So people are overly conservative in this idea that they could go back to work even if they needed to financially and at least find some income. For some reason, we stack all these conservative assumptions. And last but not least, and this is a really big one, people assume that they won't be able to adjust their spending. So let's say you do leave work, you think you have enough money, you have a bad sequence of returns. Why can't you adjust your spending? This is something people do all the time. The reason why I bring all this up is just like when it comes to our retirement savings, when it comes to leaving our jobs, we tend to stack these conservative assumptions. And when you stack them all together, which is what people tend to do, the answer then is I should never leave work because there's always going to be a reason I'm not going to have enough money. And that keeps us in our jobs much longer than we want to be, jobs that we don't like. You know what's really funny? The one thing people are never conservative on is their amount of time left on this earth. The one conservative assumption that maybe we should make, which is that we could die at any time and it would be all over just like that. Poof. We don't have a lot of time to waste. So with all these conservative assumptions we stack, we seem not to make the most important one, which is that time is precious. And it's limited. All right, I think I leave things rolling just for a few minutes to catch whatever we talk about after. Anything from that blog post that I missed? I mean, there's so much good there, and you did do some calculations that we didn't get into those specifically because I didn't think we needed to, but it's a great article.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, nothing from that article that we missed. Some interesting things that I've written about before and I might have linked to in this article. And here's an example. So we talked about Social Security, let's say for a couple, and let's assume that a couple is going to collect $40,000 a year of Social Security. Now, if we do the 4% rule backwards, and I guaranteed you a payment of $40,000 for the rest of your life, well, how much of a portfolio would that be?
Yeah, it's $1 million. Yeah.
It's $1 million. That's right. So for someone to say, I'm going to overlook Social Security, it's nothing. That's potentially $1 million mistake. And if you want to say, no, Jesse, that's wrong because you start collecting Social Security at 62 and you're going to be dead by 82, it's only a 20-year outlay. That's fine. Maybe it's a $600,000 or $700,000 mistake. So I think that turning a pension or Social Security into a lump sum as part of your net worth or portfolio, it's huge.
It's a great inflation hedge, right? And so it's also a great hedge against increased healthcare costs in older age. It's a good hedge against long-term care costs. I mean, there's so many wonderful things that it can mitigate the risk of, that to completely just deny the possibility of being there. And, you know, the other side of that is most of us paid into it, right? So you've been paying into it this whole time. You might as well, you know, it might as well benefit you. You paid it in the form of taxes to start with off of your income. So it might as well end up being what supports you so that you can work a little less. And I think,
right.
Yeah.
That's
I think
huge.
a lot of us, go ahead.
Well, no, you go. Because I have another weird one, but I think it's kind of intriguing. But what were you going to say?
I was just going to also say that I love that you really got into in this article the whole stacking component, because I think that's where we all make a huge mistake. It's fine to be conservative, but we do it too often on too many different inputs. And so I think it's a real brilliant point that most of us miss out on.
Yeah, thank you. And the other weird one too is I kind of talked about that the aerospace example of here's a 1 in 1,000 event and a 1 in 100 event and a 1 in 10,000 event. And in that case, I need to protect against all of them, which is why those things stack up into such a high factor of safety for engineering. But in retirement, it's this weird idea that, you know, imagine I had 1,000 people and I knew 10 of them were going to have a catastrophic kind of like a long-term care issue, or maybe just such a longevity issue. They were going to have something in retirement that they really needed to protect against. Well, all 1,000 people are going to be overly conservative. 990 of them don't need to be. And to some extent, they would all be better served somehow by pooling some of their money together in some form of insurance pool, knowing that only 10 or 20 are going to collect on it. That would be a great thing if it existed. And the sad thing is it does exist. It exists in a pretty bastardized, cancerous form called variable annuities, or some sort of pushy BS, terrible, bloated annuity. But in its purest form, like that's the weird thing is, like in its purest form, an annuity is that type of longevity insurance that Jonathan Clements, I know, he and I talked about it. He has I don't even know what it's called because I don't deal with annuities. I don't want to deal with annuities, but it's a lifetime fixed something annuity. It's basically the simplest form of annuity that you can get with a very, very low fee. But it's just it's so interesting when you look at the financial industry in some places and you're like, how did we end up with these terrible, awful products? And the answer is at one point it was probably well thought out and has a legitimate purpose.
Yeah.
And just over time has been bastardized by sales culture. So anyway, that's an interesting part.
But annuities, I mean, there are lots of so a SPIA, or you know, there are lots of good reasons for annuity in a portfolio. More, I think, too, for our mental sense of well-being.
Right.
Then there aren't other ways to slice the same pie.
Yeah.
But yeah, unfortunately, like you said, a lot of them have been bastardized to the point where you're not exactly sure what you're getting. But the theory is a great theory.
Correct.
The theory makes a huge amount of sense. And so if you can get your hands on the right product, and there's the other issue that we all worry about is if I'm doing this at the age of 50, will that insurance company still be around when I'm 80?
Right.
And that's also one of the other risks, because even the insurance pools put together by the government to protect against that stuff, it's not 100%. And you could take a haircut. It's always possible. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.